Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're looking at the situation in Iran. We're going to read a few articles and, more importantly, understand vocabulary from the perspective of a native speaker. At the end of the lesson, you're going to find a conversation that I designed for you using a lot of the vocabulary from this lesson, plus some interesting expressions that you can use to help you speak better. Remember, all of the notes from this lesson are free on my Patreon. You just have to sign up. So, let's start. Protesters pull down Islamic Republic flag in Tehran. Now, immediately, I see a phrasal verb. And you know I love phrasal verbs. Pull something down. Pull is when you use force, usually using your body, so a lot of strength. But we can modify this verb. These protesters pulled the flag down. The flag was up, so they pulled it down in protest. But usually, when we're operating machinery or lifting something, we can also pull something up. So it depends on the context. Not a flag, but something from down to up. But let's think of some other situations. Maybe you're crossing a street, so you have to pull something across the street. Phrasal verbs change depending on the conversation. Now, phrasal verbs are also in relation to your body, depending on the context, of course, so you can even pull something across your body. Maybe if you're working out at the gym and you're using the machinery to exercise, you're pulling it across your body. But let's modify it even more. Maybe you're pulling it in this direction. How do you communicate this direction towards your body? Well, a secret in English is that you would pull something in. In represents, in some contexts, the direction of your body. And the opposite of in is the word out. But we don't pull out. That's a little strange. Maybe pull outside, but not pull out, meaning away from your body. That's this verb, which is different. The opposite of pull, which is, if you know, it's push. So we can create the phrasal verb push out. And we can understand this relationship with your body, pull in, push out, in the phrasal verb stretch out. This is why we use out. It's away from your body when you stretch. This is why they say at the gym, stretch out your muscles. You're stretching them away from your body. We're already off topic. Let's continue with Iran. Footage received shows protesters pulling down the flag of the Islamic Republic on a city street overnight in capital Tehran. Now, over represents an arc, the shape of an arc from point A to point B. And intuitively, we can imagine the moon or the sun crossing the sky, making this shape. So, when we understand that, we can understand that overnight means during the night. So, this happened overnight. This happened during the night. Let's continue. Protesters back in Tehran streets following Trump's message on 6th day. Tehran snapped back into protest mode following 2 nights of relative quiet shortly after Donald Trump warned the United States was locked and loaded to intervene if Iran kills peaceful demonstrators. Snap is like this. Can you snap your fingers and make a sound? I can. But I can't with my left actually. I can only do it with my right hand and it makes a sound. But That's snap. So when you snap your fingers, that's something very quick. So the word snap is related to something fast or quick. So if you snap back, you change your situation. You go back very quickly. So the city snapped back into protest mode. So it became the protest mode, following 2 nights of relative quiet. So we have a few phrasal verbs here. We had pull down and all of the modifications with pull, and we have snap back into a mode or some kind of situation. So those are some phrasal verbs for you. Let's go to the next article. In Mashhad in northeastern Iran, the country's second largest city after Tehran, protesters took down and tore apart the state flag of the Islamic Republic, according to Iran International. Now, before we get to the phrasal verbs, my favorite part, we have the country's second largest city. When we're talking about the first or the second or the third, we usually use the best. For example, the largest. This is number one. But if you want to say number two or number three, you say the second best or the second largest. Number three would be the third best or the third largest. And this goes all the way up from fourth to fifth, sixth, seventh, and etc. Remember, we make that TH sound at the end of everything after third. So the fourth best, the fifth best, the sixth best, the fourth largest, the fifth largest, and you describe cities or other things like that. But now we have take down. And remember, take, took, and taken are the forms of take. So just like pull down, the protesters took down the flag. And they did something else. We have another verb in English, which is tear. And before we look at the meaning of the word tear, I'm going to show you the forms. We have tear, tore, and torn, just like wear, wore, and worn. We also have a more complicated verb, bear, bore, and born. So when you're learning verbs, I always recommend trying to find different patterns or similarities between verb forms. It's very important. But what is the verb tear? Well, when you have a paper or something, some kind of fabric, you can tear the fabric. You tear it. And apart means it's separated. So you tear it apart. It becomes two pieces. And you can imagine that's what happened to the flag of Iran after the protesters took it down. After the protesters pulled down the flag, they tore it apart. A group of protesters in the holy city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran took down a huge flag of the Islamic Republic, the report said. Mashhad is Iran's second largest city after Tehran. Let's go to the next article. Remember, we're analyzing the vocabulary. As Iranian flags fall in Tehran, the Islamic Republic faces its most profound crisis of legitimacy. Well, we saw that the protesters pulled down the flag. They took down the flag. So we can also say the flags fell. They were kind of defeated. That's what this means. The flags fell. The government could also fall. And the Islamic Republic, Iran faces or faces its most profound crisis of legitimacy. Now, for all of you people who speak Spanish or Italian or Portuguese or French, you understand that the word profound means deep. But what's the difference between profound and deep? Well, profound is usually in some kind of context to describe a situation. It's more descriptive of a word for situations and things like that. Uh, Deep is generally in the context of water or something like that. For example, water would not be profound. Water would only be deep. But deep can also be used for emotions. So profound, let's say not water, deep, water or emotions. So profound is more descriptive and artistic. The symbolic act of protesters tearing down national flags in Iran's capital represents not just political dissent, but a fundamental rejection of the Islamic Republic's claim to represent the Iranian people. Here we can see tearing down. So we're combining pull down and tear down. We can see how pull down and take down and tear down are all related. So this doesn't just represent political dissent, but a fundamental rejection of the Islamic Republic. Political dissent is a collocation that goes together. Remember, a collocation, words that go together. And that just means a public disagreement or opposition to a government. So it's kind of a crisis. It's political dissent, a rejection, a fundamental rejection of the Islamic Republic's claim to represent the Iranian people. Let's go to the next article. Iran plunged into internet blackout as protests over economy spread nationwide. Plunge, the verb to plunge, is a quick drop, or a quick decrease. So Iran, the situation, the government was plunged. They fell very quickly. It was a quick drop into a blackout. What type of blackout? An internet blackout. But what is that word, blackout? Well, black, when a room is black or a city is black, you can't see any light. There's no light. So we can imagine that a blackout is without light. Remember, out means no power or electricity. We have expressions with the word out. We can say the lights are out. We can also use the phrasal verb go out. For example, the lights went out. So a blackout is very descriptive and it's more intense. The lights went out in the city. In this case, the internet went out in the city and everything was black. There was no light, no power, no electricity. We call this a power outage or an internet outage. An outage is the noun for out. We're going to see that in just a second. Security forces reported to have killed at least 45 people since protests began 12 days ago as protesters gather in Tehran. To have killed, when we see to have and third form, this is about the past. So this is the infinitive. To kill would be the infinitive, but to have killed is about the past. This was in my previous lesson. where we saw news about the shooting in Minnesota. So if you want to see more about that, go watch that lesson. But at least is a word for the minimum, the minimum. And the way we use at least is at least number. So that's the minimum number. There could be more people who were killed, but it's at least 45 right now. And the number could go up. Iran was plunged into a complete internet blackout on Thursday night as protests over economic conditions spread nationwide, increasing pressure on the country's leadership. We know plunged into a complete internet blackout as protests over or protests about. When we have over in this situation, it really just means about. So protests about the economic conditions spread nationwide. While it was unclear what caused the internet cut, first reported by the Internet Freedom Monitor NetBlocks, Iranian authorities have shut down the internet in response to protests in the past. So we have the internet cut. This is the internet outage. But outage usually implies that maybe it was by accident, maybe it was a storm or something. But cut is intentional. So the government intentionally cut the power. And of course, I love phrasal verbs. We can create more to cut off the power. So they cut off the power. Off often represents when there is no more connection. So if you cut something off, the connection breaks into two different parts. So they cut off the power. We have shut down. I think a lot of you know shut down. Shut is a word for close, like when you tell someone to shut up. You're telling them, close your mouth, stop talking, shut up. Okay, it's very rude, extremely rude. Don't say that to people unless you really don't like this person. Shut up. But shut down is very common for computers. Shut your computer down, the power stops. There's no more power. So you shut down your computer, no more power to your computer. So let's continue. NetBlocks had reported outages in the western city of Kermanshah earlier in the day as authorities intensified their crackdown against protesters. Before we continue, you know crackdown from the last lesson. This is when there are strict rules about something going on. So it's very strict. They're cracking down on protests, and that's how we use the verb crack down on, or there's a crackdown in the city. So you can use this word in different situations. Here we have there's a crackdown against, in opposition to, a crackdown against the protesters. The Norway-based NGO Iran Human Rights, or IHR, said on Thursday that Iranian security forces had killed at least 45 protesters, including 8 children, since the demonstrations began in late December. If you watched the last lesson about the situation in Minnesota, you'll remember that I taught the verb stand for something. And here we have NGO. Again, if you know what NGO stands for, please write it in the comments. But I'm going to tell you. It means non-governmental, I believe non-governmental organization. IHR stands for Iran human rights. And remember, when we use the verb stand for something, we just say what these letters mean. So, non-governmental organization or Iran human rights. Let's go to the next article. Amid protests, Khamenei digs in and says Iran won't back down to saboteurs. Trump will be overthrown. He's very angry at my president, but many people are these days. But anyway, amid, the word amid. We can see that mid is in the word amid, so we can understand this possibly means middle. So, in the middle of protests. In the middle of protests or during protests, Khamenei digs in. If you know the word dig, like with a shovel, you can kind of understand what this means, but I have a picture to show you. This is a worker digging a hole, and the hole is getting deeper, so he keeps digging and digging and going in. Well, if you look at this from the perspective of some war or conflict, it doesn't look like he wants to move. It looks like he wants to stay and defend, right? If you're going down, deeper in, you're digging in, you're becoming more defensive. So the Iranian leader is becoming more defensive. He's not going anywhere. He's staying. And he says that Iran won't back down. To back down is just another way to say accepting defeat. So if you think about it, you go back and you go down. That sounds like someone was defeated if you go back and down. That's not a position of strength. That means defeated. But Iran says they won't back down. They won't stop resisting to saboteurs. We have this word in English, and this comes from French. To sabotage is the main verb, and we're going to see a little of this later. He says Trump will be overthrown. Overthrown means removed from power. So, one more time. During the protests, Khamenei becomes more defensive, digs in, and he says Iran won't stop resisting. Iran won't back down. Iran will fight. And Iran won't back down to saboteurs, people trying to sabotage him. And Trump will be removed from power. Trump will be overthrown, according to him. Let's continue. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, vows that the Islamic Republic will not back down in the face of protesters whom he called vandals and saboteurs in a speech broadcast on state TV. We just saw some of this, but to vow means to promise something. It's a very formal promise. And we often see this in marriages. So a marriage is a very formal ceremony, and you give your vows. You give your very serious promises. But he vows, seriously promises, that the Islamic Republic will not back down. We saw the word saboteur, which is to sabotage. But here we have vandals. And we also have a verb in English to vandalize. I believe this is in many other languages too. This comes from European history, the Vandals, right? And vandals are people who want to create chaos. But let's continue. In his first comments on the escalating protests since January 3rd, Khamenei said US President Donald Trump's hands are stained with the blood of more than 1,000 Iranians and predicted the arrogant US leader would be overthrown, like the imperial dynasty that ruled Iran up to the 1979 revolution. He said that President Donald Trump's hands are stained with the blood of more than 1,000 Iranians. But what is a stain? Well, I'm wearing a red sweater and I love to drink coffee. And let's imagine that this morning I was drinking my coffee and I spilled it on this beautiful red sweater. Now I have a coffee stain on my sweater. It's a mark. It's an ugly mark, a dirty mark, and it's hard to get out in the wash. So, what he's saying here is Donald Trump's hands are stained or marked with Iranian blood. And we have a few expressions in English about this situation. So we can say, blood is on your hands after you commit a crime. Generally, murder. So the way to say this is you're accusing the person of committing murder, of killing people, of creating more blood, and it's on your hands, so you're responsible. Blood is on your hands, or more intensely, your hands are stained with blood. It's very intense. He accuses protesters of acting on behalf of Trump, saying rioters were attacking public properties and warning that Tehran will not tolerate people acting as mercenaries for foreigners. The protesters were acting on behalf of Trump, according to him. And on behalf of a person is a very specific expression which just means in the name of. So, acting on behalf of someone, doing something in the name of that person. Basically, acting for that person. So he's saying these people were acting for Donald Trump. But okay, we just read some news. We learned a lot of vocabulary about this news, and now I would like to show you some conversations that I wrote for you using some of this vocabulary in a very natural context so you can speak better. And here we go. Did you hear about the news out of Iran? Yeah, of course. It's all over the internet. Protesters tore down the state flag. I think the government is in trouble. First, the question, did you hear about, is often with news. So, hear about something is connected to news. And the way we think about the word about in English is generally information, subjects, or something like that. That's what about represents. For example, you can say, I know about something, or I read about something, or did you hear about the information? And we can also modify a lot of other verbs. For example, see about something. If you say see about something, it just means go see about that situation. So go to that situation and observe what's going on. Get that information. So remember, about is generally connected to information. That's why we say hear about the news. The news out of a place. This is very common when talking about news that's coming out of a place, generally a country. Did you hear about the news out of America? Did you hear about the news out of Venezuela, for example? It's all over the internet. It's all over the internet. In my last lesson, I mentioned that over is connected to the word cover. It's actually in the word if you look at it. So all over the internet means covering the internet in every place on the internet. Very natural expression. It's all over the internet. It's all over the place. We remember tore down. So let's go to the next part of the conversation. I saw a video where they ripped it into pieces in the street. They're pretty angry over there. I know. And the government shut off the internet. Can you imagine the government shutting off the internet? That's so extreme. Rip. The verb rip is the same as tear. And we already learned tear at the beginning of this lesson. And remember, tear is just like this, right? With my paper towel here. But we can tear something into smaller pieces, or the same verb, rip something into other pieces, into small pieces. So that's what they did with the flag. And they're pretty angry over there. Over there, we often use the word over with location. Over in that country, over there. We're kind of imagining point A to point B. So that's why we use over with location. When I point, I actually say over there. So you can see the arc of my finger. It's over there. That's why we say over. The government shut off the internet, just like you shut down your computer. And here we have an interesting expression. Can you imagine someone, the government, shutting off the internet? With my students, when I do private lessons with them, we often study differences between ing and to. And after certain verbs, very specific verbs, we often use the ing form. Imagine is one of those verbs. So, uh, imagine plus ing, not imagine to shut off the internet, but imagine shutting off the internet. Let's continue. There's a nationwide blackout. People can't message or post anything. They don't want the people to communicate. They're trying to shut everything down. Before, we learned the word blackout, when there's no light and there's a power outage. I think you know the rest of this conversation, so let's continue. Well, protesters are still calling for economic changes and more freedom. They deserve it. Yeah, but the leadership isn't backing down. They're cracking down hard on demonstrations like they always do. When you call for something, you're publicly voicing your opinion. So the protesters are publicly voicing their opinion. They're calling for economic changes and more freedom. But the leadership isn't backing down. Remember, if you back down, you surrender. But they're not surrendering, they're digging in. And they're cracking down hard on demonstrations. Final part of the conversation. I don't know about that. I heard that the leader of the country is trying to get out. He wants to flee to Moscow. We'll see what happens. The world keeps falling apart, little by little. When we use the expression, I don't know about that, it means I'm not sure. This is a very specific expression that we use very frequently in American English. We say, I don't know about that. I'm not sure about that. The leader of the country is trying to get out. Get out of the country, because remember, he's in the country. The opposite of in is out. He wants to get out, and he wants to flee to a place. To flee means to run away or to escape. And finally, she says the world keeps falling apart. Remember, apart means different pieces. So when you tear something apart or rip something into pieces, or you tear something apart, like I said, then you have little pieces. So the world is starting to look like the paper that I have here. It's falling apart. Before it was very cohesive and one unit, but now there's a lot of chaos. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot. Please join my Patreon. It's free. You can see all of the notes from this lesson, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.